Lloyd, and this sounds really intriguing. Big numbers, really big numbers, are not for us to grasp. That's probably because there's nothing in our day-to-day experience that's big enough for us to picture. That's a problem, because there's a really big number that has really big consequences for every one of us. We need to understand that number and what those consequences are. This evening, for question and answer session, the elective project that will complete level 4 of the visionary communication path, Lloyd Smith will discuss that really big number. A question and answer session will follow his speech. Lloyd Smith and the 2.2 quadrillion pennies. Wrap your mind around that one.
That's exactly correct. We're surrounded by big numbers, but it's almost impossible for us to actually grasp really big numbers. There's a theory, in fact, that we're genetically prone to that because we just have 10 fingers and we count on them. That might have served Og the caveman okay, but it doesn't work so well for us. And the big number I'm going to be talking about tonight is the United States federal budget. Now, make an effort to stay awake. I can tell already that some of you are zoning out, but this is a really big number that has dramatic consequences for us. That big number is $22 trillion, okay? Now, there's no way any of us can grasp that number. But let's think about a number, a realistic number. What would you guess if I asked you how many minutes have elapsed since Jesus was alive? Would you think it's a trillion?
Yeah, a trillion.
More than
Okay.
that.
Well, you're wrong. It's just a little over 1 billion. And a trillion is 1,000 billions. Okay, give that a moment's thought. Yeah, it's a big number. So the way I'd like to approach this is by making it into a number that's much easier to understand. Technical term for that would be a small number. Let's assume that instead of $4 trillion, the annual federal budget is just $1, 100 pennies. Okay, let's get a grip on this. I have notes because there's a bunch of numbers in this speech, and it's important to keep them straight. Lots of people have a lot of misconceptions about the U.S. federal budget. You hear a lot of really crazy ideas, really uninformed ideas, and a lot of flat-out lies. And so I'd like to kind of correct this tonight. The obvious question is, where does the money go? Okay, in 2017, the federal budget was $3.8 trillion. Okay, now why don't I have current year? Because it's still in progress. There's no way to know what's going to be spent. And the data for the past year, 2018, has not yet been aggregated. So it's 2017 dollars. So first of all, the biggest budget category is Social Security, unemployment, and Labor Department costs. That's 33 of our pennies. Okay, they're only 100 pennies, and that's where a bunch of them go. Now, a bunch of people will tell you that Social Security is not really a federal budget item. And in a sense, that's true, but it's money that the federal government sends out. And so I'm counting it in my 100 pennies. The next biggest category is somewhat related, Medicare and health costs, which is another 27 pennies. We're already well over halfway to our total of 100 pennies. The one that everybody seems to think about is military spending, which is 16 pennies. And you're beginning to see. Now, when the Republicans tell us that social programs are the ones that are dominating the budget, they're actually correct about that. The military is 16 pennies. The other two are over half of our pennies. Now, the next category is one that surprises a lot of people, and that's interest on past debt, which is 6 pennies. Now, the federal budget is an interesting thing. Whenever it goes into the red, that money has to be borrowed from somewhere, so the interest gets added into the next federal budget. And in about 40 years, this 6 pennies is going to be larger than the other categories. The bulk of the federal budget is going to be spent on interest on past borrowing to fund past budgets. You might want to think about that. It's an image to put in your mind is running down a flight of steps carrying a heavy box. You're probably going to be okay till you reach the bottom step. And then you're not going to be okay anymore. And that's the position we're in. The next category is veterans benefits. That's 4 pennies. That's quite a bit, and that number is going to get bigger. The estimate for caring for the veterans of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, the injured soldiers and whatnot, is $2 trillion as time goes on. That's a very large amount of money. The Vietnam veterans are in the process of dying off. They're all my age or older, but the young ones from Iraq and Afghanistan are not, and so their cost could go on for decades. The next thing down the line is food and agriculture. That's another 4 pennies. The 2 big items in there are is usually called food stamps. It's actually something called SNAP, Supplemental Nutritional Something Program, and farm subsidies. Lots and lots of corporations who run major corporate farms spend their time gazing at their federal subsidies ripening in the fields, and that includes that. Now after that, we have transportation. Or no, I'm sorry, education, 3 pennies. That's what the federal government throws into it. That's total education, college on down the line. Transportation, that includes the railroads, freeways, everything else you can think of, is 2 pennies. Housing development, that includes subsidized housing, another 2 pennies. Have you ever heard somebody tell you that if the U.S. didn't give out so much foreign aid, the budget problem would be solved? Foreign aid is half of one of these pennies. The whole penny pays for all of foreign affairs, international affairs. Energy and the environment, 1 penny. That includes cleaning up environmental disasters and whatnot. Have you ever heard anybody tell you that if we didn't shoot so much money into outer space, the budget problem would be solved? Our entire space program is half of this penny. The other half is all of the other science spending. And that's it. That gives you a visual representation of what's going on with the federal budget. Now here's the thing. The other half of the budget is the income, the revenues. Individual and corporate income taxes, customs duties, excise taxes, and tariffs produce 57 of those pennies. Okay, Social Security taxes and Medicare taxes produce 29 of those pennies. Those of you who are math attuned realize we are 14 pennies short. So where do we get them? We borrow them. And this year, we are borrowing 14 more pennies. In real world money, that's $1 trillion. Okay? Now what has happened? 2 things. Is that it used to be that the Republicans favored cutting spending and cutting taxes. The Democrats favored increasing spending and increasing taxes. 2 years ago, both of them had an epiphany. We can have both. We can increase spending and cut taxes. And that's exactly the budget deal that the President's Budget Office and the Congressional Democrats worked out. And so last week, the Congressional Budget Office estimated that the annual deficit on the budget will be $1 trillion. So every year, $1 trillion will get added to the 22 trillion we've already got. That's a really, really big number. There are really only 2 choices that we have. We can either spend less or we can collect more. But if we act like adults, we've got to do one of those 2 things. We can't go on doing what we're doing. One real reason for that is that that money that is being spent today is going to be paid for by future generations. So it's not likely you're going to meet your great-great-great-great-great-grandchildren, but if that were to happen, you should thank them for all the great stuff you're getting today and not paying for. Okay, what I'd like to do now is entertain questions about any of this that are popping in your mind. Yeah, Pat.
What is your best recommendation for guaranteeing a more stable financial future for those who follow us?
Increased taxes. We have the lowest taxes of any modern industrialized nation, and in this country right now, our total tax burden, state, federal, and local taxes, is lower than it was in 1956, President Eisenhower's first year, or second term in office. We're not paying for what we're getting. We just have decided that we can have it for free. Well, actually, we've decided it's not free, we're just putting it on the credit card. Steve, did you?
I've heard it said well in advance of this year, this 17 budget, that the party's over. We couldn't repay that debt if we quit borrowing and if we quit spending every possible dollar. We still don't make enough revenue in this country to pay down the debt. It's like just a matter of time until we're in program.
In a sense, that's true. The total debt, the 22 trillion, is actually larger than the gross domestic product. Okay, so that's not a good sign. You know, in other words, the debt we owe is bigger than all of the goods and services we produce in the country. However, if you think about it a different way, it's like when you buy a house, you may know something about that, but it's very rare that anybody could just write a check for a house they want to buy. The trick is, can they pay for it, you know, by borrowing and spreading it out over time? Right now, we can, but as the debt gets larger and larger and larger, this one, the interest on past debt, starts getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and pretty soon it'll overwhelm the rest of it. So, in one sense, yeah, you're right. There is coming a day of reckoning. Santa Claus is not going to come 1 year.
I'm surprised actually that fourth pile of pennies isn't already bigger.
Well, it's getting bigger. It's a geometric progression.
Right.
You know, it's the fastest growing budget category by far.
Well, we'll have to do a speech next year.
Yeah. Yeah, Vicki.
So is it compound interest that we're going to be paying, and do you know what the interest rate is?
Not really compound interest. The form that the borrowing takes is a special kind of government bond.
Okay.
It's what's called full faith and credit bond. It comes off the top first. In other words, the federal government's obligated to pay
That one.
that debt first before they pay anything else. That's where the problem's going to happen in a number of years. But it's not compound interest. Right now, we're getting a really good rate. The government's paying about 2.8% on those bonds, which sounds like crap, but it's actually pretty good money for a bond. And it's a bond that there's zero risk. That's why people buy them. There's a theory that China owes all of our debt. Actually, China owes about 3% of our debt. Owns about 3% of our debt.
Okay.
The bulk of the federal debt is owned by the Social Security system. Because when you see that, what is it, FICA? Is that what it is on the Social Security tax, payroll tax? That money goes to the federal government. Well, they don't just gather up boxes of money. They buy those bonds with it. And so that has to be paid back. But foreign governments don't control us because of this debt. Okay.
You said we have two choices, either spend less or collect more.
Oh, the third choice, you could both, I guess.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, have you thought about the third choice being maybe inflated away?
Well, yeah, you could. Inflation means print more money. Just run the printing presses, okay? So in other words, you would be paying back the debt with money that is worth less than the current money, which seems to solve the problem. I mean, like if you just print $22 trillion, problem solved right away. But that has an impact on all of us too, because when inflation occurs, that raises consumer prices. Because like, General Motors is not going to sell you a pickup for inflated dollars for the same price you pay with current dollars. The inflation is probably a worse thing than the debt when you get right down to it. But it is a tricky problem. We're in the soup. The good news is all of us will probably be dead before the popcorn really hits the fan. But not your descendants. They're going to be cursing your name. Don't worry about it. The party's great right now. Yeah, Lou?
Are there any historical examples for where that ratio gets untenable in terms of debt to GDP?
Not in modern times. Economics is a really murky science. I'm not even sure you'd call it a science, because people with absolutely opposite viewpoints can both win the Nobel Prize. I mean, could that happen in chemistry, for example? Or physics? One guy says there is gravity, the other guy says there isn't, and both of them get a Nobel Prize. But anyway, there are historic examples, but this idea of deficit spending is actually a relatively new thing in human history. It used to be that people didn't try to spend money that they didn't have. I know how radical an idea that seems, but there once was a time.
So going on that, is it correlated to when they started offering like credit cards to the public that the government went, oh, we could borrow money too, or were they borrowing money?
I'm not really sure when it happened. I mean, there's been deficit spending forever. That's how the U.S. funded our participation in World War I and again in World War II, although those war bonds were rather quickly paid off afterwards. The idea of rolling it over decade after decade after decade is the new thing. Some of you who are older may remember in the year 2000 when George W. Bush and Al Gore were running for president, one of their 3 debates was devoted to the topic of what to do with the federal budget surpluses that were building up. The last 4 years of Clinton's term, the government ran a quarter of a trillion dollar surplus each of those years. And so the question became what to do with that money. Bush was in favor, and Bush said, well, obviously everybody's been overcharged on taxes, so we should have a big tax cut. And Gore said, no, what we ought to do is apply half of that to the Social Security system to keep it solvent, and the other half to paying down the debt. It turns out Bush won the election, but Gore was correct about the argument. But can you imagine that, $250 billion surplus in the federal budget? And that's because President Clinton and the congressional Republicans agreed to increase taxes somewhat and reduce spending. So that solution would not work right now because the numbers are much, much bigger now than they were back then. The budget, the annual budget was less than $1 trillion back then. Now it's closer to $5 trillion. And
There's some out there that say if you cut taxes, it'll boost capital investment, create more jobs and spending and more wealth, and there's a trickle-down effect. Does that argument still hold water, or has it been debunked?
highly controversial. There doesn't seem to be an effect from Trump's big tax cut of what, two and a half years ago, or whenever that was. Generally speaking, the cuts are not evenly distributed across taxpayers. They tend to favor corporations and the wealthier brackets of taxpayers. But, and the evidence seems to suggest that corporations, when they get their taxes cut, don't necessarily invest in new jobs and whatnot. They buy back their own stock, which does not create real economic activity. That's actually a kind of a separate issue from the deficit issue. The real thing about the deficit is that that's the debt we owe, as opposed. And it does have an impact, though, because when you cut taxes, obviously less revenue is coming in. That's why we have to borrow those 14 of these pennies. And then borrow more of them the next year, and then more of them the year after that, and on and on and on, until that stack will become bigger than all of these other stacks put together. And that won't be a happy day. As I said, maybe we'll all be dead by then. Hey, you have to have something to look forward to. Avoiding this is going to be a big thing to look forward to. Any other questions? Thank you very much. Madam Clerk.